Chapter 1, Commodities. The wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of a commodity. A commodity is, in the first place, an object outside us, a thing that by its properties satisfies human wants of some sort or another. The nature of such wants, whether, for instance, they spring from the stomach or from fancy, makes no difference. Neither are we here concerned to know how the object satisfies these wants, whether directly as means of subsistence or indirectly as means of production. Every useful thing, as iron, paper, and so on, may be looked at from the 2 points of view of quality and quantity. It is an assemblage of many properties and may therefore be of use in various ways. To discover the various uses of things is the work of history. So also is the establishment of socially recognized standards of measure for the quantities of these useful objects. The diversity of these measures has its origin partly in the diverse nature of the objects to be measured, partly in convention. The utility of a thing makes it a use value, but this utility is at a thing of air. Being limited by the physical properties of the commodity, it has no existence apart from that commodity. A commodity such as iron, corn, or a diamond is therefore, so far as it is a material thing, a use value, something useful. This property of a commodity is independent of the amount of labor required to appropriate its useful qualities. When treating of use value, we always assume to be dealing with definite quantities, such as dozens of watches, yards of linen, or tons of iron. The use values of commodities furnish the material for a special study, that of the commercial knowledge of commodities. Use values become a reality only by use or consumption. They also constitute the substance of all wealth, whatever may be the social form of that wealth. In the form of society we're about to consider, they are, in addition, the material depositories of exchange value. Exchange value, at first sight, presents itself as a quantitative relation, as the proportion in which values in use of one sort are exchanged for those of a given commodity, e.g., a quarter of wheat is exchanged for X blacking, silk, or Z gold, and so on, in short, for other commodities in the most different proportions. Instead of one exchange value, the wheat has, therefore, a great many. But since X blacking, Y silk, or Z gold, and so on, each represents the exchange value of 1/4 of wheat. X blacking, E silk, Z gold, and so on, must, as exchange values, be replaceable by each other or equal to each other. Therefore, first, the valid exchange values of a given commodity express something equal. Secondly, exchange value generally is only the mode of expression, the phenomenal form of something contained in it, yet distinguishable from it. Let us take two commodities, e.g. corn and iron. The proportions in which they are exchangeable, whatever those proportions may be, can always be represented by an equation in which a given quantity of corn. Compare the areas of rectilinear figures. We decompose them into triangles, but the area of the triangle itself is expressed by something totally different from its visible figure, namely by half the product of the base multiplied by the altitude. In the same way, the exchange values of commodities must be capable of being expressed in terms of something common to them all, of which thing they represent a greater or less quantity. And this common something cannot be either a geometrical, a chemical, or any other natural property of commodities. Such properties claim our attention only insofar as they affect the utility of those commodities, make them use values. But the exchange of commodities is evidently an act characterized by a total abstraction from use value. Then one use value is as 100 pounds worth of silver or gold. As use values, commodities are, above all, of different qualities. But as exchange values, they are merely different quantities, and consequently do not contain an atom of use value. If then we leave out of consideration the use value of commodities, they have only one common property left, that of being products of labor. But even the product of labor itself has undergone a change in our hands. If we make abstraction from its use value, we make abstraction at the same time from the material elements and shapes that make the product a use value. We see in it no longer a table, a house, yarn, or any other useful thing. Its existence as a material thing is put out of sight. Neither can it any longer be regarded as the product of the labor of the joiner, the mason, the spinner, or of any other definite kind of productive labor, along with the utilization of homogeneous human labor, of labor power expended without regard to the mode of its expenditure. All that these things now tell us is that human labor power has been expended in their production, that human labor is embodied in them. When looked at as crystals of this social substance, common to them all, they are values. We have seen that when commodities are exchanged, their exchange value manifests itself as something totally independent of their use value. But if we abstract from their use value, there remains their value as defined above. Therefore, the common substance that manifests itself in the exchange value of commodities, whenever they are exchanged, is their value. The progress of our investigation will show that exchange value to be measured plainly by the quantity of the value creating substance, the labor, contained in the article. The quantity of labor, however, is measured by its duration. And labor dying in its turn finds its standard in weeks, days, and hours. Some people might think that if the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of labor spent on it, the more idle and unskillful the laborer, the more valuable would his commodity be, because more time would be required in its production. The labor, however, that forms the substance of value is homogeneous human labor, expenditure of one uniform labor power. The total labor power of society, which is embodied in the sum total of the values of all commodities produced by that society, counts here as one homogeneous mass of human labor power, composed, though it be, of innumerable individuals at the time. The introduction of power looms into England probably reduced by 1/2 the labor required to weave a given quantity of yarn into cloths. The hand loom weavers, as a matter of fact, continued to require the same time as before. But for all that, the product of 1 hour of their labor represented, after the change, only half an hour's social labor, and consequently fell to 1/2 its former value. We see then that that which determines the magnitude of the value of any article is the amount of labor socially necessary, or the labor time socially necessary for its production. Each individual commodity in this connection is to be considered as an average sample of its class. Commodities, therefore, in which equal quantities required for its production also remain constant, but the latter changes with every variation in the productiveness of labor. This productiveness is determined by various circumstances, amongst others, by the average amount of skill of the workman, the state of science, and the degree of its practical application, the social organization of production, the extent and capabilities of the means of production, and by physical conditions. For example, the same amount of labor in favorable seasons is embodied in 8 bushels of corn, and in unfavorable only in 4. The same labor extracts from rich mines more metal than from poor mines. Diamonds are of very rare occurrence on the Earth's surface, and hence their Discovery costs, on an average, a great deal of labor. Consequently, much labor is represented in a small compass. Jacob doubts whether gold has ever been paid for at its full value. This applies still more to diamonds. According to Oswego, the total produce of the Brazilian diamond are bricks. In general, the greater the productiveness of labor, the less is the labor time required for the production of an article. The less is the amount of labor crystallized in that article, and the less is its value, and vice versa. The less the productiveness of labor, the greater is the labor time required for the production of an article, and the greater is its value. The value of a commodity, therefore, varies directly as the quantity and inversely as the productiveness of the labor incorporated in it. A thing can be a use value without having value. This is the case whenever its utility to man is due to labor. Such are air, virgin soil, natural meadows, and so on. A thing can be useful and the product of human labor without being a commodity. Whoever directly satisfies his wants with the produce of his own labor creates indeed use values, but not commodities, by means of an exchange. Lastly, nothing can have value without being an object of utility. If the thing is useless, so is the labor contained in it. The labor does not count as labor and therefore creates no value. Section 2, the twofold character of the labor embodied in commodities. At first sight, a commodity presented itself to us as a complex of two things, use value and exchange value. Later on, we saw also that labor, too, possesses the same twofold nature, for so far as it finds expression in value, it does not possess the same characteristics that belong to it as a creator of use values. And I was the first to point out and to examine critically this twofold nature of the labor contained in commodities, as this point is the pivot on which a clear comprehension of political operation, subject, means, and result. The labor, whose utility is thus represented by the value and use of its product, or which manifests itself by making its product a use value, we call useful labor. In this connection, we consider only its useful effect. As the coat and the linen are two qualitatively different use values, so also are the two forms of labor that produce them, tailoring and weaving. Were these two objects not qualitatively different, not produced respectively by labor of different quality, they could not stand to each other in the relation of commodities. Coats are not exchanged for coats. One use value is in exchange for another of the same kind. To all the different varieties of values in use there correspond as many different kinds of use by the operatives mutually exchanging their individual products. Only such products have become commodities with regard to each other as result from different kinds of labor, each kind being carried on independently and for the account of private individuals. To resume, then, in the use value of each commodity there is contained useful labor, i.e., productive activity of a definite kind, and exercised with a definite aim. Use values cannot confront each other as commodities unless the useful labor embodied in them is qualitatively different in each of them. In a community, the produce of which in general takes the form of commodities, i.e. in a community of commodity producers, the qualitative difference between the useful forms of labor that are carried on independently of individual producers, each on their own account, develops into a complex system, a social division of labor. Anyhow, whether the coat be worn by the tailor or by his customer, in either case, spontaneous produce of nature must invariably owe their existence to a special productive activity, exercised with a definite aim, an activity that appropriates particular nature-given materials to particular human wants. So far, therefore, as labor is a creator of use value, is useful labor. It is a necessary condition, independent of all forms of society, for the existence of the human race. It is an eternal nature-imposed necessity, without which there can be no material exchanges between man and nature, and therefore no life. The use values, coat, linen, and so on, i.e. the bodies of commodities, are combinations of two elements, matter and labor. If we take away the useful labor expended upon them, a material substratum is always left, which is furnished by nature without the help of man. The latter can work only as nature does, that is, by changing the form of matter. Nay, more, in this work of changing the form, this is a mere quantitative difference, which for the present does not concern us. We bear in mind, however, that if the value of the coat is double that of 10 meters of linen, 20 meters of linen must have the same value as one coat. So far as they are values, the coat and the linen are things of a like substance, objective expressions of essentially identical labor. But tailoring and weaving are, qualitatively, different kinds of labor. There are, however, states of society in which one and the same man does tailoring and weaving alternately, in which case these two forms of labor are mere modifications of the labor of the same individual, and not special and fixed functions of different persons, just as the coat which our tailor makes one day and the trousers which he makes another day imply only a variation in the labor of one and the same individual. Moreover, we see at a glance that, in our capitalist society, a given portion of human labor is, in accordance with the varying demand, at one time supplied in the form of of course, this labor power, which remains the same under all its modifications, must have attained a certain pitch of development before it can be expended in a multiplicity of modes. But the value of a commodity represents human labor in the abstract, the expenditure of human labor in general. And just as in society, a general or a banker plays a great part, but mere man, on the other hand, a very shabby part, so here with mere human labor. It is the expenditure of simple labor power, i.e. of the labor power which, on an average, apart from any special development, exists in the organism of every ordinary individual. Simple average labor, it is true, varies in character in different countries and at different times, but in a particular society it is given. Skilled labor counts only as simple labor intensified, or rather as multiplied simple labor, given quantity of skilled being considered equal to a greater quantity of simple labor. Experience shows that this reduction is constantly appear to be fixed by custom. For simplicity's sake, we shall henceforth account every kind of labor to be unskilled, simple labor. By this we do no more than save ourselves the trouble of making the reduction. Just as therefore in viewing the coat and linen as values we abstract from their different use values, so it is with the labor represented by those values. We disregard the difference between its useful forms, weaving and tailoring. As the use values, coat and linen, are combinations of special productive activities with cloth and yarn, while the values, coat and linen, are, on the other hand, mere homogeneous conjugations of undifferentiated labor. So the labor embodied in these latter values does not count by virtue of its productive relation to cloth and yarn, but only as being expenditure of human labor power. Tailoring and weaving are necessary factors in the creation of the use values, coat and linen, precisely because these two kinds of labor are of different qualities, but only insofar as the linen contains only half as much labor as the coat, and consequently, that in the production of the latter, labor power must have been expended during twice the time necessary for the production of the former. While therefore with reference to use value, the labor contained in a commodity counts only qualitatively, with reference to value it counts only quantitatively, and must first be reduced to human labor pure and simple. In the former case, it is a question of how and what, in the latter of how much, how long a time. Since the magnitude of the value of a commodity represents only the quantity of labor embodied in it, follows that all commodities, when taken in certain proportions, must be equal in value. If the productive power of all the different sorts of useful labor required for the production of a coat remains unchanged, The sum of the values of the coats produced and labor spent on its production has altered. An increase in the quantity of use values is an increase of material wealth. With 2 coats, 2 men can be clothed. With 1 coat, only 1 man. Nevertheless, an increased quantity of material wealth may correspond to a simultaneous fall in the magnitude of its value. This antagonistic movement has its origin in the twofold character of labor. Productive power has reference, of course, only to labor of some useful, concrete form. The efficacy of any special productive activity during a given time being dependent on its productiveness. Useful labor becomes, therefore, a more or less abundant source of products in proportion to the rise or fall of its productiveness. On the other hand, no change in this productiveness affects the labor represented by value. Since productive power is an attribute of the concrete useful forms of labor, of course, it no longer have any bearing on that labor so soon as we make abstraction from those concrete useful forms. However, provided such change shorten the total labor time necessary for their production, and vice versa. On the one hand, all labor is, speaking physiologically, an expenditure of human labor power, and in its character of identical abstract human labor, it creates and forms the value of commodities. On the other hand, all labor is the expenditure of human labor power in a special form and with a definite aim, and in this, its character of concrete, useful labor, it produces use values. Section 3, the form of value or exchange value. Commodities come into the world in the shape of use values, articles, or goods, such as iron, linen, corn, and so on. This is their plain, homely bodily form. They are, however, commodities only because they are something twofold, both objects of utility, composition. Turn and examine a single commodity by itself, as we will, yet insofar as it remains an object of value, it seems impossible to grasp it. If, however, we bear in mind that the value of commodities has a purely social reality, and that they acquire this reality only insofar as they are expressions or embodiments of one identical social substance, viz., human labor, it follows, as a matter of course, that value can only manifest itself in the social relation of commodity to commodity. In fact, we started from exchange value, or the exchange relation of commodities. In order to get at the value that lies hidden behind it, we must now return to this form under which value first appeared to us. Everyone knows, if he knows nothing else, that commodities have a value form common to them all and presenting a marked contrast with the varied bodily forms of their use values. I mean their money form. Here, however, a task is set us, the performance of which has never yet even supplies us with the simplest expression of the value of a single commodity. A elementary or external form of value, X commodity A, commodity B, or X commodity A is worth Y commodity B. 20 yards of linen, 1 coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth 1 coat. 1. The 2 poles of the expression of value, relative form and equivalent form. The whole mystery of the form of value lies hidden in this elementary form. Its analysis, therefore, is our real difficulty. Here are 2 different kinds of commodities. In our example, the linen and the coat evidently play 2 different parts. The linen expresses its value in the coat, but at the same time are mutually exclusive, antagonistic extremes, i.e. poles of the same expression. They are allotted respectively to the 2 different commodities brought into relation by that expression. Is it possible to express the value of linen in linen? 20 yards of linen, 20 yards of linen is no expression of value. On the contrary, such an equation merely says that 20 yards of linen are nothing else than 20 yards of linen, a definite quantity of the use value linen. The value of the linen will therefore be expressed only relatively, i.e. in some other commodity. The relative form of the value of the linen presupposes, therefore, the presence of some other commodity. Here, the coat under the form of an equivalent. On the other hand, the commodity that figures as the equivalent cannot at the same time assume the relative form. That second commodity is the one whose value is expressed. Its function is merely to serve as the material in which the value of the first commodity is expressed. No doubt, the single commodity cannot, therefore, simultaneously assume in the same expression of value both forms. The very polarity of these forms makes them mutually exclusive. Whether then a commodity assumes the relative form or the opposite equivalent form depends entirely upon its accidental position in the expression of value. That is, upon whether it is the commodity whose value is being expressed or the commodity in which value is being expressed. 2. The relative form of value. A, the nature and import of this form. In order to discover how the elementary expression of the value of a commodity lies hidden in the value relation of two commodities, we must, in the first place, consider the latter entirely apart from its quantitative aspect. Whether 20 yards of linen, 1 coat, or 20 coats, or X coats, that is, whether a given quantity of linen is worth few or many coats, every such statement implies that the linen and coats, as magnitudes of value, are expressions of the same unit, things of the same kind. Linen coat is the basis of the equation. But the two commodities whose identity of quality is thus assumed do not play the same part. It is only the value of the linen that is expressed. And how? By its reference to the coat as its equivalent, as something that can be exchanged for it. In this relation, the coat is the mode of existence of value, is value embodied, for only as such is it the same as the linen. On the other hand, the linen's own value comes to the front, receives independent expression, for it is only as being value that it is comparable with the coat, as a thing of equal value, too. Therefore, by thus equating the two substances, expression would be given to their chemical composition, while their different physical forms would be neglected. If we say that as values, commodities are mere congealations of human labor, we reduce them by our analysis, it is true, to the abstraction value, but we ascribe to this value no form apart from their bodily form. It is otherwise in the value relation of one commodity to another. Here, the one stands forth in its character of value by reason of its relation to the other. By making the coat the equivalent of the linen, we equate the labor embodied in the former to that in the latter. Now, it is true that the tailoring which makes the coat is concrete labor of a different sort from the weaving which makes the linen, but the act of equating it to the weaving reduces the tailoring to that which is really equal in the two kinds of labor. There is, however, something else required beyond the expression of the specific character of the labor of which the value of the linen consists. Human labor, power in motion, or human labor, creates value, but is it itself value? It becomes value only in its congealed state, when embodied in the form of some object. In order to express the value of the linen as a congelation of human labor, that value must be expressed as have objective existence, as being as something materially different from the linen itself, and yet as something common to the linen and all other commodities. The problem is already solved. When occupying the position of equivalent in the equation of value, the coat ranks qualitatively as the equal of the linen, as something of the same kind, because it is out of that relation. Just as many a man strutting about in a gorgeous uniform counts for more than when in mufti. In the production of the coat, human labor power in the shape of tailoring must have been actually expended. Human labor is therefore accumulated in it. In this aspect, the coat is a depository of value, But though worn to a thread, it does not let this fact show through. And as the equivalent of the linen in the value equation, it exists under this aspect alone, counts therefore as embodied value, as a body that is value. A, for instance, cannot be your majesty to be, unless at the same time majesty in B's eyes assumes the bodily form of A, and what is more, with every new father of the people, changes its features, hair, and many other things besides. Hence in the value equation, in which the equality with the coat, just as the sheep's nature of a Christian is shown in his resemblance to the Lamb of God. We see then all that our analysis of the value of commodities has already told us, is told us by the linen itself, so soon as it comes into communication with another commodity, the coat. Only it betrays its thoughts in that language with which alone it is familiar, the language of commodities, in order to tell us that its own value is created by labor in its abstract character of human labor. It says that the coat, insofar as it is worth as much as the linen, and therefore its value, consists of the same labor as the linen. In order to inform us that its sublime reality is value, is the same as its buckram body, it says that value has the appearance of a coat, and consequently, mass. Paris is certainly worth a mass. By means, therefore, of the value relation expressed in our equation, the bodily form of commodity B becomes the value form of commodity A, or the body of commodity B acts as a mirror to the value of commodity A by putting itself in relation with commodity B as value and propria personos, as the matter of which human labor is made up. The commodity A converts the value in use, B, into the substance in which to express its A's own value. The value of A, thus expressed in the use value of B, has taken the form of relative value. B, quantitative determination of relative value. Every commodity whose value it is intended to express, in general, made the equal in quality of the linen. But a definite quantity of coat and coat is made the equivalent of a definite quantity, 20 yards of linen. The equation, 20 yards of linen, one coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth one coat, implies that the same quantity of value, substance, congealed labor is embodied in both, that the two commodities have each cost the same amount of labor or the same quantity of labor time. But the labor time necessary for the production of 20 yards of linen or one coat varies with every change in the productiveness of weaving or tailoring. We have now to consider the influence of such changes on the quantitative aspect of the relative expression of value. I, let the value of the linen vary, that of the coat remaining constant. If, say in consequence of the exhaustion of flax, the relative value of commodity A, i.e. its value expressed in commodity B, rises and falls directly as the value of A, the value of B being supposed constant. 2, let the value of the linen remain constant, while the value of the coat varies. If under these circumstances, in consequence, for instance, if a poor crop of wool, the labor time necessary for the production of a coat becomes doubled, we have, instead of 20 yards of linen, one coat, 20 yards of linen, dwarf a coat. If, on the other hand, the value of the coat sinks by 1/2, then 20 yards of linen, 2 coats. Hence, if the value of commodity A remain constant, its relative value expressed in commodity B rises and falls inversely as the value of B. If we compare the different cases of labor, time respectively necessary for the production of the linen and the coat vary simultaneously in the same direction and in the same proportion. In this case, 20 yards of linen continue equal to 1 coat. however much their values may have altered. Their change of value is seen as soon as they are compared with a third commodity whose value has remained constant. If the values of all commodities rose or fell simultaneously and in the same proportion, their relative values would remain unaltered. Their real change of value would appear from the diminished or increased quantity of commodities produced in a given time. The stimuli, or I or yours, but how Richie we target about I level. All you need, and anything, I am during making offer, but membership may vary, although its value remains constant. Its relative value may remain constant, although its value varies. And finally, simultaneous variations in the magnitude of value and in that of its relative expression by no means necessarily correspond in amount. 3. The equivalent form of value. We have seen that commodity A, the linen, by expressing its value in the use value of a commodity differing in kind, the coat at the same time impresses upon the latter a specific form of value, namely that of the equivalent. The commodity linen manifests its quality of having a value by the fact that the coat, without having assumed a value form different from its bodily form, is equated to the linen. The fact that the latter therefore has a value is expressed by saying that the coat is directly exchangeable with it. Therefore, when we say that a commodity is the equivalent and the coat is relevant value, the magnitude of the coat's value is determined, independently of its value form, by the labor hours necessary for its production. But whenever the coat assumes in the equation of value the position of equivalent, its value acquires no quantitative expression. On the contrary, the commodity coat now figures only as a definite quantity of some article. For instance, 40 yards of linen are worth what? 2 coats. Because the commodity coat here plays the part of equivalent. Because the use value coat, as opposed to the linen, figures as an embodiment of value. Therefore, a definite number of coats suffices to express the definite quantity of value in the linen. 2 coats may therefore express the quantity of value of 40 yards of linen, but they can never express the quantity of their own value. A superficial observation of this fact, namely, that in the equation of value, the equivalent figures exclusively as a simple quantity of some article of some use value, has misled Bailey, as also many others, both before and after him, into seeing in the expression of value merely a quantitative relation. The truth being that when a commodity acts as equivalent, no quantitative determination of its value enters into a value relation with it, and then only within the limits of this relation. Since no commodity can stand in the relation of equivalent to itself and thus turn its own bodily shape into the expression of its own value, every commodity is compelled to choose some other commodity for its equivalent and to accept the use value, that is to say, the bodily shape of that other commodity, as the form of its own value. One of the measures that we apply to commodities as material substances, as use values, will serve to illustrate this point. A sugar loaf, being a body, is heavy and therefore has weight. But we can neither see nor touch this weight. We then take various pieces of iron, whose weight has been determined beforehand. The iron, as iron, is no more the form of manifestation of weight than is the sugar loaf. Nevertheless, therefore not serve as the expression of the weight of the other. When we throw both into the scales, we see in reality that as weight they are both the same, and that, therefore, when taken in proper proportions, they have the same weight. Just as the substance iron, as a measure of weight, represents in relation to the sugar loaf weight alone, so, in our expression of value, the material object, coat, in relation to the linen, represents value alone. Here, however, the analogy ceases. The iron in the expression of the weight of the sugar loaf represents a natural property common to both bodies, namely their weight, but the coat in the expression of value of the linen represents a non-natural property of both, something purely social, namely their value. Since the relative form of value of a commodity, the linen, for example, expresses the value of that. If on the one hand the coat ranks as nothing but the embodiment of abstract human labor, so on the other hand the tailoring, which is actually embodied in it, counts as nothing but the form under which that abstract labor is realized. In the expression of value of the linen, the utility of the tailoring consists not in making clothes, but in making object, which we at once recognize to be value and therefore to be a congelation of labor, but of labor indistinguishable from that realized in the value of the linen. In order to act as such a mirror of value, the labor of tailoring must reflect nothing besides its own abstract quality of being human labor generally. In tailoring as well as in weaving, human labor power is expended. Both therefore possess the general property of being human labor and may therefore, in certain cases, such as in the production of value, have to be considered under this aspect alone. There is nothing mysterious in this. But in the expression of value, there is of the equivalent form is that concrete labor becomes the form under which its opposite, abstract human labor, manifests itself. But because this concrete labor, tailoring in our case, ranks as and is directly identified with undifferentiated human labor, it also ranks as identical with any other sort of labor, and therefore with that embodied in the linen. Consequently, although, like all other commodity-producing labor, it is the labor of private individuals, yet at the same time, it ranks as labor directly social in its character. This is the reason why it results in a product directly exchangeable with other commodities. We have then a third peculiarity of the equivalent form, namely that the labor of private individuals takes the form of its opposite, labor directly social in its form. Of the value of one commodity in some other commodity taken at random. For he said, 5 beds, 1 house. Is it to be distinguished from 5 beds, so much money? He further sees that the value relation which gives rise to this expression makes it necessary that the house should qualitatively be made the equal of the bed, and that without such an equalization, these two clearly different things could not be compared with each other as commensurable quantities. Exchange, he says, cannot take place without equality, and equality not without commensurability. And it's odis meiosis symmetrias. Here, however, he comes to a stop and gives equal something, that common substance, which admits of the value of the beds being expressed by a house. Such a thing, in truth, cannot exist, says Aristotle. And why what? Compared with the beds, the house does represent something equal to them, insofar as it represents what is really equal, both in the beds and the house, and that is human labor. There was, however, an important fact which prevented Aristotle from seeing that to attribute value to commodities is merely a mode of expressing all labor as equal human labor, and consequently as labor of equal quality. Greek society was founded upon slavery and had, therefore, for its natural basis, the inequality of men and of their labor powers. The secret of the expression of value, namely, that all kinds of labor are equal and equivalent, because insofar as they are human labor in general, cannot be was at the bottom of this equality. 4. The elementary form of value considered as a whole. The elementary form of value of a commodity is contained in the equation, expressing its value relation to another commodity of a different kind, or in its exchange relation to the same. The value of commodity A is qualitatively expressed by the fact that commodity B is directly exchangeable with it. Its value is quantitatively expressed by the fact that a definite quantity of B is exchangeable with a definite quantity of A. In other words, the value of a commodity obtains independent and definite expression by taking the form of exchange value. When at the beginning of this chapter we said in common parlance that a commodity is both a use value and an exchange value, we were, accurately speaking, wrong. A commodity is a use value or object of utility, and a value. It manifests itself as this twofold thing. Mercantilists and their recent revivers, Ferrier, Garneta, and others, as also of their antipodes, the modern bagmen of free trade, such as Bastiat. The mercantilists lay special stress on the qualitative aspect of the expression of value, and consequently on the equivalent form of commodities, which attains its full perfection in money. The modern hawkers of free trade, who must get rid of their article at any price on the other hand, lay most stress on the quantitative aspect of the relative form of value. For them, there consequently exists neither value nor magnitude of value anywhere except in its expression by means of the exchange relation of commodities, that is, in the daily list of prices current. MacLeod, who has taken upon himself to dress up the confused ideas of Lombard Street in the most learned finery, is a successful cross between the superstitious mercantilists and the enlightened free trade bagmen. A close scrutiny of the expression to be expressed figures directly as mere exchange value. Hence, the elementary form of value of a commodity is the elementary form in which the contrast contained in that commodity between use value and value becomes apparent. Every product of labor is, in all states of society, a use value, but it is only at a definite historical epoch in a society's development that such a product becomes a commodity, viz. At the epoch when the labor spent on the production of a useful article becomes expressed as one of the objective qualities of that article, i.e. as its value. It therefore follows that the elementary value form is also the primitive form under which a product of labor appears historically as a commodity, and that the gradual transformation of such products into commodities proceeds pari passu with the development of the value form. We complete form. It is true that by means of the elementary form, the value of a commodity A becomes expressed in terms of one, and only one, other commodity. But that one may be a commodity of any kind, coat, iron, corn, or anything else. Therefore, according as A is placed in relation with one or the other, we get for one and the same commodity different elementary expressions of value. The number of such possible expressions is limited only by the number of the different kinds of commodities distinct from it. The isolated expression of A's value is therefore convertible into a series prolonged to any length of the different elementary expressions of that value. B, total or expanded form of value, Z-com, A, U-com, B, or V-com, C, or W-com, D, or com, E, R, and so on. 20 yards of linen as a congelation of undifferentiated human labor. For the labor that creates it now stands expressly revealed as labor that ranks equally with every other sort of human labor, no matter what its form, whether tailoring, plowing, mining, and so on. And no matter, therefore, whether it is realized in coats, corn, iron, or gold. The linen, by virtue of the form of its value, now stands in a social relation, no longer with only one other kind of commodity, but with the whole world of commodities. As a commodity, it is a citizen of that world. At the same time, the interminable series of value equations implies that as regards the value of a commodity, it is a matter of indifference under what particular form or kind of use value it appears. In the first form, 20 years in linen, one coat, it might, for aught that otherwise appears, be pure accident, that these two commodities are exchangeable in definite quantities, proportions. 2, the particular equivalent form. Each commodity, such as coat, tea, corn, iron, and so on, figures in the expression of value of the linen as an equivalent, and consequently as a thing that is value. The bodily form of each of these commodities figures now as a particular equivalent form, one out of many. In the same way, the manifold, concrete, useful kinds of labor embodied in these different commodities rank now as so many different forms of the realization or manifestation of undifferentiated human labor. 3. Defects of the total or expanded form of value. In the first place, the relative expression of value is incomplete because the series of an interminable series of expressions of value. The defects of the expanded relative value form are reflected in the corresponding equivalent form. Since the bodily form of each single commodity is one particular equivalent form amongst numberless others, we have, on the whole, nothing but fragmentary equivalent forms, each excluding the others. In the same way also, the special, concrete, useful kind of labor embodied in each particular equivalent is presented only as a particular kind of labor, and therefore not as an exhaustive representative of human labor generally. The latter indeed gains adequate manifestation in the totality of its manifold particular concrete forms, but in that case, its expression in an infinite series is ever incomplete and deficient in unity. The expanded relative value form is, however, nothing but the sum of the elementary relative expressions or equations of the first kind, the limit. If then we reverse the series, 20 yards of linen, 1 coat, or 10 pounds of tea, etc. That is to say, if we give expression to the converse relation already implied in the series, we get C, the general form of value, 1 coat, 10 pounds of tea, 40 pounds of coffee, 1/4 of corn, 2 ounces of gold, 100 a ton of iron, X commodity A, etc. 20 yards of linen. 1. The altered character of the form of value. All commodities now express their value, 1, in an elementary form, because in a single commodity. And iron. This form, it is plain, occurs practically only in the first beginning, when the products of labor are converted into commodities by accidental and occasional exchanges. The second form, B, distinguishes in a more adequate manner than the first the value of a commodity from its use value. For the value of the coat is there placed in contrast under all possible shapes with the bodily form of the coat. It is equated to linen, to iron, to tea, in short, to everything else, only not to itself, the coat. On the other hand, any general expression of value common to all is directly excluded, for in the equation of value of each commodity, all other commodities now appear only under the form of equivalence. The expanded form of value comes into actual existence for the first time so soon as a particular product of labor, such as cattle, is known as that which is common to all commodities. By this form, commodities are, for the first time, effectively brought into relation with one another as values, or made to appear as exchange values. The two earlier forms either express the value of each commodity in terms of a single commodity of a different kind, or in a series of many such commodities. In both cases, it is, so to say, the special business of each single commodity to find an expression for its value, and this it does without the help of the others. These others, with respect to the former, play the passive parts of equivalence. The general form of value, C, results from the joint action of the whole world of commodities, and from that alone. A commodity acquires a general expression of its value only by all other commodities simultaneously with it, expressing their values in the same equivalent. And every new commodity also compared with each other. For instance, 10 pounds of tea, 20 yards of linen, and 40 pounds of coffee, 20 yards of linen. Therefore, 10 pounds of tea, 40 pounds of coffee. In other words, there is contained in 1 pound of coffee only 1/4 as much substance of value, labor, as is contained in 1 pound of coffee. The general form of relative value, embracing the whole world of commodities, converts the single commodity that is excluded from the rest and made to play the part of equivalent, here the linen, into the universal equivalent. The bodily form of the linen is now the form assumed in common by the values of all commodities. It therefore becomes directly exchangeable with all and every of them. The substance linen becomes the visible incarnation, the social chrysalis state of every kind of human labor. Weaving, which is the labor of certain private individuals, produces all kinds of actual labor to their common character of being human labor generally, of being the expenditure of human labor power. The general value form, which represents all products of labor as mere congealations of undifferentiated human labor, shows by its very structure that it is the social resume of the world of commodities. Its form consequently makes it indisputably evident that in the world of commodities, the character possessed by all labor, being human labor, constitutes its specific social character. 2, the interdependent development of the relative form of value and of the equivalent form. The degree of development of the relative form of value commodity acquires the character of universal equivalent because all other commodities make it the material in which they uniformly express their value. The antagonism between the relative form of value and the equivalent form, the 2 poles of the value form, is developed concurrently with that form itself. The first form, 20 years of linen, 1 coat, already contains this antagonism without as yet fixing it. According as we read this equation forwards or backwards, the parts played by the linen and the coat are different. In the one case, the relative value of the linen is expressed in the coat. In the other case, the relative value of the coat is expressed in the linen. In this first form of value, therefore, it is difficult to grasp the polar contrast. Form B shows that only one single commodity, thereby all commodities, with the exception of one, are excluded from the equivalent form. A single commodity, the linen, appears therefore to have acquired the character of direct exchangeability with every other commodity because, and insofar as, this character is denied to every other commodity. The commodity that figures as universal equivalent is, on the other hand, excluded from the relative value form. If the linen or any other commodity serving as universal equivalent were, at the same time, to share in the relative form of value, it would have to serve as its own equivalent. We should then have 20 ids of linen, 20 ids of linen. This tautology expresses neither value nor magnitude of value. In order to express the relative value of the universal equivalent, we must rather reverse the form C. This equivalent has no relative form of ours. It has been excluded from the rest of all other commodities as their equivalent, and that by their own act. And from the moment that this exclusion becomes finally restricted to one particular commodity, from that moment only, the general form of relative value of the world of commodities obtains real consistence and general social validity. The particular commodity with whose bodily form the equivalent form is thus socially identified now becomes the money commodity, or serves as money. It becomes the special social function of that commodity, and consequently its social monopoly to play within the world of commodities the part of the universal equivalent. Amongst the commodities which, in Form B, figure as particular equivalents of the linen, and in Form C, express in common their relative values in linen, this foremost place has been attained by one in particular and D, except that in the latter, gold has assumed the equivalent form in the place of linen. Gold is in Form D, what linen was in Form C, a universal equivalent. The progress consists in this alone, that the character of direct and universal exchangeability, in other words, that the universal equivalent form has now, by social custom, become finally identified with the substance, gold. Gold is now money with reference to all other commodities, only because it was previously, with reference to them, a simple commodity. Like all other commodities, it was also capable of serving as an equivalent, either as simple equivalent in isolated exchanges or as particular equivalent by the side of others. Gradually, it began to serve, within varying limits, as universal that commodity, the price form of that commodity. The price form of the linen is therefore 20 yards of linen, 2 ounces of gold, or if 2 ounces of gold when coined are £2, 20 yards of linen, £2. The difficulty in forming a concept of the money form consists in clearly comprehending the universal equivalent form, and as a necessary corollary, the general form of value, form C. The latter is deducible from form B, the expanded form of value, the essential component element of which we saw is form A, 20 yards of linen, 1 coat, or X commodity A, Y commodity B. The simple commodity form is therefore the germ of the money form. Section finished by nature in such a way as to make them useful to him. The form of wood, for instance, is altered by making a table out of it. Yet for all that, the table continues to be that common, everyday thing, wood. But so soon as it steps forth as a commodity, it is changed into something transcendent. It not only stands with its feet on the ground, but in relation to all other commodities, it stands on its head and evolves out of its wooden brain grotesque ideas, far more wonderful than table turning ever was. 26A. The mystical character of commodities does that originate, therefore, in their use value. Just as little does it proceed from the nature of the determining factors of value. For in the first place, however varied the useful kinds of labor or productive activities may be, it is a physiological fact that they are functions of the human organism, and that each such function, whence then arises the enigmatical character of the product of labor, so soon as it assumes the form of commodities. Clearly from this form itself, the equality of all sorts of human labor is expressed objectively by their products, all being equally values. The measure of the expenditure of labor power by the duration of that expenditure takes the form of the quantity of value of the products of labor. And finally, the mutual relations of the producers, within which the social character of their labor affirms itself, take the form of a social relation between the products. A commodity is therefore a mysterious thing, simply because in it the social character of men's labor appears to them as an objective character stamped upon the product of that labor, because the relation of the producers to the sum total of their own labor, between physical things. But it is different with commodities. There, the existence of the things qua commodities and the value relation between the products of labor which stamps them as commodities have absolutely no connection with their physical properties and with the material relations arising therefrom. There it is a definite social relation between men that assumes, in their eyes, the fantastic form of a relation between things. In order, therefore, to find an analogy, we must have recourse to the mist-enveloped regions of the religious world. In that world, the productions of the human brain appear as independent beings, endowed with life and entering into relation both with one another and the human race. So it is in the world of commodities with the products of men's hands. This I call the fetishism which attaches itself to the products of labor. So soon as they are produced as commodities, and which is there for each producer's labor, does not show itself except in the act of exchange. In other words, the labor of the individual asserts itself as a part of the labor of society, or by means of the relations which the act of exchange establishes directly between the products and indirectly through them between the producers. To the latter, therefore, the relations connecting the labor of one individual with that of the rest appear not as direct social relations between individuals at work, but as what they really are, material relations between persons and social relations between things. It is only by being exchanged that the products of labor acquire as values one uniform social status, distinct from their varied forms of existence as objects of utility. This division of a product into a useful thing and a value becomes practically important only when exchange has acquired such an extension that useful articles are produced for the purpose of being exchanged, and their character as values has therefore to be taken into account. The private useful labor of each producer ranks on an equality with that of all others. The equalization of the most different kinds of labor may be the result only of an abstraction from their inequalities, or of reducing them to their common denominator, viz. Expenditure of human labor power or human labor in the abstract. The twofold social character of the labor of the individual appears to him, when reflected in his brain, only under those forms which are impressed upon that labor in everyday practice by the exchange of products. In this way, the character that his own labor possesses of being socially useful takes the form of the condition that the product must be not only useful, but useful for others. And the social character that his particular labor has of being the equal of all other particular kinds of labor takes the form that all the physically different articles that are the products of labor have one common quality, viz. That of have the hieroglyphic, to get behind the secret of our own social products. For to stamp an object of utility as a value is just as much a social product as language. The recent scientific discovery that the products of labor, so far as they are values, are but material expressions of the human labor spent in their production, marks indeed an epoch in the history of the development of the human race, but by no means dissipates the mist through which the social character of labor appears to us to be an objective character of the products themselves. The fact that in the particular form of production with which we are dealing, viz. The production of commodities, the specific social character of private labor carried on independently, consists in the equality of every kind of that labor by virtue of its being human labor, which character, therefore, assumes in the product the form of value. This fact appears to the producers value as a pound of gold and a pound of iron, in spite of their different physical and chemical qualities, appear to be of equal weight. The character of having value, when once impressed upon products, obtains fixity only by reason of their acting and reacting upon each other as quantities of value. These quantities vary continually, independently of the will, foresight, and action of the producers. To them, their own social action takes the form of the action of objects, which rule the producers instead of being ruled by them. It requires a fully developed production of commodities before, from accumulated experience alone, the scientific conviction springs up that all the different kinds of private labor, which are carried on independently of each other and yet as spontaneously developed branches of the social division of labor, are continually being reduced to the quantitative proportions in which society requires them. And why? Because in the midst of all the accidental mode in which that determination takes place, man's reflections on the forms of social life, and consequently also his scientific analysis of those forms, take a course directly opposite to that of their actual historical development. He begins post festum with the results of the process of development ready to hand before him. The characters that stamp products as commodities and whose establishment is a necessary preliminary to the circulation of commodities have already acquired the stability of natural, self-understood forms of social life before man seek to decipher not their historical character. For in his eyes, they are immutable, but their meaning. Consequently, it was the analysis of the prices of commodities that alone led to the determination of the magnitude of value. And it was the common expression of all commodities in money that alone led to the establishment of their characters as values. It is, however, just the ultimate money form. The categories of bourgeois economy consist of such like forms. They are forms of thought expressing with social validity the conditions and relations of a definite, historically determined mode of production, viz. The production of commodities. The whole mystery of commodities, all the magic and necromancy that surrounds the products of labor as long as they take the form of commodities vanishes, therefore, so soon as we come to other forms of production. Since Robinson Crusoe's experiences are a favorite theme with political economists, let us take a look at him on his island. Moderate though he, yet some few wants he has to satisfy, and must therefore do a little useful work of various sorts, such as making tools and furniture, taming goats, fishing and hunting. Of his prayers and the like we take no account, since they are a source of pleasure to him, and he looks upon them as so much recreation. The operations necessary for their production, and lastly, of the labor, definite quantities of those objects have, on an average, cost him. All the relations between Robinson and the objects that form this wealth of his own creation are here so simple and clear as to be intelligible without exertion, even to Mr. Sedley Taylor, and yet those relations contain all that is essential to the determination of value. Let us now transport ourselves from Robinson's Island, bathed in light, to the European Middle Ages, shrouded in darkness. Here, instead of the independent man, we find everyone dependent, serfs and lords, vassals and suzerains, laymen and clergy. Personal dependence here characterizes the social relations of production just as much as it does the other spheres of life organized on the basis of that. The tithe to be rendered to the priest is more matter of fact than his blessing. No matter then what we may think of the parts played by the different classes of people themselves in this society, the social relations between individuals in the performance of their labor appear at all events as their own mutual personal relations, and are disguised under the shape of social relations between the products of labor. For an example of labor in common or directly associated labor, we have no occasion to go back to that spontaneously developed form which we find on the threshold of the history of all civilized races. We have one close at hand in the patriarchal industries of a peasant family that produces corn, cattle, yarn, linen, and clothing for home use. These different articles are, as regards the family, so many products of its labor, but as between themselves, as a definite portion of the whole labor power of the family. And therefore, the measure of the expenditure of individual labor power by its duration appears here by its very nature as a social character of their labor. Let us now picture to ourselves, by way of change, a community of free individuals carrying on their work with the means of production in common, in which the labor power of all the different individuals is consciously applied as the combined labor power of the community. All the characteristics of Robinson's labor are here repeated, but with this difference, that they are social instead of individual. Everything produced by him was exclusively the result of his own personal labor, and therefore simply an object of use for himself. The total product of our community is a social product. One portion serves as fresh means of production and remains social, but another portion is consumed by the members as means of subsistence borne by each individual, and of his share in the part of the total product destined for individual consumption. The social relations of the individual producers with regard both to their labor and to its products are in this case perfectly simple and intelligible, and that with regard not only to production but also to distribution. The religious world is but the reflex of the real world note, and for a society based upon the production of commodities, in which the producers in general enter into social relations with one another by treating their products as commodities and values, whereby they reduce their individual private labor to the standard of homogeneous human labor for such a society. Christianity, with its cultus of abstract man, more especially in its bourgeois developments, Protestantism, deism, and so on, is the most fitting form of religion. In the ancient, or upon direct relations of subjection, they can arise and exist only when the development of the productive power of labor has not risen beyond a low stage, and when, therefore, the social relations within the sphere of material life between man and between man and nature are correspondingly narrow. This narrowness is reflected in the ancient worship of nature and in the other elements of the popular religions. The religious reflex of the real world can, in any case, only then finally vanish when the practical relations of everyday life offer to man none but perfectly intelligible and reasonable relations with regard to his fellow men and to nature. The life process of society, which is based on the process of material production, does not strip off its mystical veil. These formulae, which bear it stamped upon them in unmistakable letters that they belong to a state of society in which the process of production has the mastery over man instead of being controlled by him, such formulae appear to the bourgeois intellect to be as much a self-evident necessity imposed by nature as productive labor itself. Hence, forms of social production that preceded the bourgeois form are treated by the bourgeois intellect to be as much a self-evident necessity imposed by nature as productive labor itself. Hence, forms of social production that preceded the bourgeois form are treated by the bourgeoisie in much the same way as the fathers of the church treated pre-Christian religions. To what extent some economists are misled by the fetishism inherent in commodities, or by the objective appearance of the social characteristics of labor, is shown, amongst other ways, by the dull and easy to be seen through. But when we come to more concrete forms, even the appearance of simplicity vanishes. Whence arose the illusions of the monetary system? To wit, gold and silver, when serving as money, did not represent a social relation between producers, but were natural objects with strange social properties. And modern economy, which looks down with such disdain on the monetary system, does not its superstition come out as clear as noonday whenever it treats of capital? How long is it since economy discarded the physiocratic illusion that rents grow out of the soil and not out of society? But not to anticipate, we will content ourselves with yet another example relating to the commodity form. Could commodities themselves speak, they would say, our use value may be a thing that interests men. It is no riches, use value are the attribute of men. Value is the attribute of commodities. A man or a community is rich. A pearl or a diamond is valuable. A pearl or a diamond is valuable as a pearl or a diamond. So far, no chemist has ever discovered exchange value either in a pearl or a diamond. The economic discoverers of this chemical element, who, by the by, lay special claim to critical acumen, find, however, that the use value of objects belongs to them independently of their material properties, while their value, on the other hand, forms a part of them as objects. What confirms them in this view is the peculiar circumstance that the use value of objects is realized without exchange, by means of a direct relation between the objects and man, while on the other hand, their value is realized only by exchange.